Alright everyone, you may have seen the news from yesterday and earlier. A bunch of soldiers actually from the nations of India and China began pelting one another with rocks along some disputed regions up there. What's happened is that China, this ties into string of pearls. China has developed the strategy of building infrastructure projects around itself all the way over to Pakistan in order to be able to outmaneuver its regional competitors. This involves the Japanese, South Korea, and/or eventually a reunited Korea, certainly India. And I said years ago that BRICS was bullcrap. It wasn't an alliance. It was a fair-weathered friends collective in which people got Chinese money to build up their own infrastructure while being screwed by the Chinese government. I dare say that all those people that thought that China was so high and mighty within BRICS are no longer laughing at me for that supposition of the actual characteristics of the so-called economic and military alliance of BRICS. The Russians have sat back and done absolutely nothing, while China and India continue to dispute over a border that they knew when they signed up for BRICS was still in question. The Pakistani government and people, of course, are right along with this. There's an enormous swath of very profitable land between these three nations that is not quite yet settled. India, to its great benefit, has already settled its land disputes with Bangladesh. They had situations there where the border, with thousands of tiny little avenues and streets, ran through certain cities to the point at which they were unnavigable. They finally managed to get things sorted out and sort of traded land until that was simplified for the movement of the Indian people and for the people of Bangladesh. It was to their extreme diplomatic benefit that Modi managed to get that accomplished, as well as the government of Bangladesh. You don't see something like that happening between India, China, and Pakistan. Here you have three nuclear states. China having a significant arsenal of very modern nuclear weapons, third largest and most sophisticated in the world. India and Pakistan have smaller arsenals, but still they do have now boosted fission weapons, significant in size, significant in number. Each of these three states has the ability to essentially annihilate the other two. And they're fighting over their borders. And BRICS is a total joke. South Africa right now can't decide whether it wants to even have some of its citizens allowed to own land. Brazil has fallen into a de facto depression. Russia has economic problems and is too busy worrying about Eastern Europe to care what happens in Asia. China and India continue to fight to see who's going to be dominant in Southeast Asia. I'm going to hedge my bets and say India will. Because India is willing to work with the Eastern Bloc, it's also willing to work with the Western world. At any given time, it can switch and close the others out. It could be our replacement China very easily. We could put all of the factories there quite easily, and China would wither as far as its economic capabilities. You wouldn't see iPhones made in China, you'd see them made in India, and probably better for the world if it were. I would much rather see products coming from India than from China. It's a more stable economic situation. More fast growing, more capability to increase its own infrastructure, more capability of basically everything under the sun, and in the future probably more manpower, to tell the truth, to secure itself against foreign threats. It'd be much easier to work with them. China and India, though, they're disputing over a road in Bhutan, several regions on their border that have never actually come to completion as far as diplomacy goes. There have been continuous border skirmishes. Now, we've seen for years now, usually it's between India and Pakistan. There's some border patrol comes under indirect fire from one side or the other. Somebody takes a pot shot or two. It's their idea of a good time, I guess, on both sides. Somebody takes a shot. The other side responds. Nobody's actually harmed or killed, but they start firing at each other. They fire over their heads or something like that. Thankfully, this has never come to an actual military engagement. For some time, since they've had nuclear weapons, they haven't directly engaged one another. Wonderful, probably best for the world that they don't. Now, though, India is getting into it with China, and they're both in BRICS. What does this say about the stability of this long-term economic situation? China has had to pump, by the way, enormous amounts of its own money into keeping its own economy afloat because growth is slacked off. India doesn't have that problem. It probably won't for another decade or two. India has the chance. My great advice to the Indian people would be you need to develop your economy as quickly as possible and look for higher efficiency, because that other growth won't last forever. Don't emulate the Chinese, because they could end up slipping backwards at any time. Unfortunately, what would probably happen if they did is they would come to blows, because then India, which right now is technically the junior partner, has less manpower than China, less nuclear capabilities, and a smaller military, suddenly would draw equal to it and maybe eclipse it. I don't think the Chinese government would be very happy with the situation. So the best case scenario is probably India moves to the Western world, leaves BRICS, leaves it as BRCS. Probably Brazil and South Africa would leave not long after. And what you would end up with is just a general economic situation between the Russians supplying a lot of raw resources and some diplomatic pressure, China supplying extra military and manpower, and that's what you would end up with. But they have come to blows. Now, for one of the first times, China and India have gotten into it. Let me tell you this as well, and most people don't know this because they've never studied the history of the country. Bhutan, years ago, directly joined the Western Alliance for a reason. They were not looking forward to the idea. They were pressured to choose a side. They chose the West. They didn't choose communism. They right now have called upon and are standing with India. This is going to eventually rip them out of BRICS with a little diplomatic maneuvering on the Western side. BRICS will cease to be. It will no longer exist. People hedging their bets on the Chinese economy need to be very, very concerned. I wouldn't do that if I was you. I'd be investing. There are places to invest. I'd be investing in India, Mexico, Eastern Europe, possibly Chile, although they've fallen to socialism, so it's not clear their own capabilities will continue. Maybe even Argentina. They've mostly restabilized. I wouldn't be investing in China. They've already peaked out. They're going to begin sloughing off. But they're fighting one another. When soldiers begin throwing rocks at one another, the Chinese response is, hey, our people would never do this first. They're trained specifically to maintain the tranquility of this border region. The India is saying, bullcrap, your guys threw rocks first. They were in our territory that we're guarding here. And our dudes would never do that. And cue the process of this happening over and over like it does between India and Pakistan. There's no real diplomatic resolution in these situations. It's going to be very, very difficult for China and India to sit down and determine where their borders lie, because both sides are going to demand the largest slice of that pie. They're not going to back down in typical fashion for the diplomacy of that region of the world, because it would be a sign of weakness. And it wouldn't be a good idea to back down. It would be better to have continuous border disputes than to back down, according to the politics of these two nations. Ultimately, though, again, I would be siding, generally speaking, with India on the topic, and I think the Western world needs to look to them more and more. India is a major player. It's no longer a minor power of the world. It's a major power of the world. We need to see India that way. We need to understand they're a nuclear state with an enormous economy and an enormous amount of manpower. They've eclipsed the UK, and we need to work with them more closely. They've proven they have the capability of building a stable state. There are many problems in India. Those problems pale in comparison to the problems in China at this point. They're capable still, especially with Western help, of outmaneuvering the Chinese and becoming the main economy of Southeast Asia. Yes, it's possible for them to do this. China's string of pearls aside. I still remember that time I had that crazy Marxist saying China was going to build the Nicaragua Canal that they've decided never to build now. He used to talk about that. He used to rant endlessly about how that would destroy U.S. hegemony over the Americas. And now it's official. It will never actually, they'll never even remove a spade full of dirt. It's going to be a Chinese military base and a Chinese-funded tourist resort and port for shipping that will use the Panama Canal, of all places, to actually ship materials. Yes, clearly Chinese invincibility is clear in Central America. It's not going to work. India would be well off as well to begin investing, I think, in parts of Eastern Africa. Take the soft-worded approach, by the way, because the Chinese government has managed to piss off a number of African nations at this point. If India goes and says, well, we'll invest in, we'll make it fair because we actually give a damn, who do you think they're going to side with long term? It's going to be India. India has the capability of doing that. It would be much easier, I think, in the long term. That's about all. Peace out.